Welcome to Business Beyond the Mic, where we join Carly Van Heerden, CEO and founder of We Edit Podcasts. Together, let's uncover the art of podcasting.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. I'm your host, Carly Van Heerden. Today in the show, we welcome Arielle Nissenblatt. Arielle is all about audio all the time. She's the community marketing manager at Descript, founder of Earbuds Podcast Collective, and consultant at Tink Media, and hosts two podcasts about the podcast industry: Feedback with Earbuds, the podcast recommendation podcast, and Trailer Park, the podcast trailer podcast. Arielle is also on the board of governors at the Podcast Academy and is one of the founding members of the Podcast Taxonomy, an international multidisciplinary effort to standardize roles and credits in the podcast space. She listens to podcasts pretty much all day long and wants to help you find your next favorite show. During our conversation, Arielle shares her passion for audio and the inspiration behind her newsletter, which eventually led to the launch of her podcast. She is such an influence in the podcasting space and brings a wealth of information when it comes to monetization strategies, building your credibility in the industry, and truly podcasting from your purpose. From there, we dive into why it is crucial to create a trailer for your show, and Arielle gives all of her best advice for creating your own. She also highlights the importance of reassessing where you are at as a podcaster and reminds us to give ourselves permission to pivot as you evolve and grow. I loved digging into her podcast story, so join us in the conversation. Arielle, welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. It's so great to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, you have such an interesting perspective with all of the millions of podcasts that you listen to and curate for people. And just your format of podcasting is so intriguing. And I'm sure we're going to get into all of that. But why don't you start us off just telling us a bit more about yourself, your business, your brand, and of course, your podcast?
Sure. I am a big time podcast listener. I listen to podcasts all the time, and that informs everything that I do, for money, not for money, with friends, with romantic partners, everything. Audio is absolutely everything. Everything that I do. I talk about it on dates. I talk about it on dating apps. I talk about it in the subway. I talk about it with anybody that will have me. I will ask them about their podcast listening habits. And it's just who I am. And the reason is because I discovered podcast listening in 2014. I started listening. It was my first job out of college, and my coworkers were all listening to Serial. And I decided that I would jump on the bandwagon and listen with them. And then we would discuss it every week. And it was just a lot of fun. And from there, I was like, I need more of this. I need to be listening to podcasts. So I made it my goal to just always be finding something that would blow my mind. And that blossomed until 2017. I started a podcast recommendation newsletter called Earbuds Podcast Collective. And I started that because I wanted to listen to more podcasts, but I was finding that other people also wanted help finding podcasts that were worth their time. There were already at the time, 2017, hundreds of thousands of podcasts. Now there's millions, and you couldn't possibly listen to hundreds of thousands. And within those hundreds of thousands, there's going to be thousands that are worth your time and that are within your niche. And how do you possibly find the ones that are going to improve your life or add value to you or be entertaining, especially for you? So this newsletter allows me to curate people who curate lists for me. And, fast forward a few years, I've now been working full-time in the podcast space since 2018. I've managed a studio. I've worked as an in-app curator. I worked at Recording Squadcast, which is a remote recording studio, and then Squadcast got acquired by Descript, so now I'm at Descript. I also do strategy and content consulting, marketing consulting on the side, and have a bunch of podcasts, like you said. So long answer, but yes, audio is everything to me.
Absolutely. It's just totally engrossed in your whole world, and I love it. So, I feel the same. It's how I live every day. That's what we're doing. And yeah, what can we do without podcasts these days?
Yeah.
But you have so much knowledge of the industry. And I mean, you totally threw yourself into everything that's podcasting, as you said. So did you face any obstacles or things before you decided, now I'm going to launch my podcast? Or what was that initial thought? This is my next step. Instead of just discussing it, I'm going to do a podcast.
Yeah. So I actually was going to not do a podcast. So I started this newsletter in 2017 called Earbuds Podcast Collective. And the way it works is that it goes out every Sunday. Each week is curated by a different person. Anyone can curate a list. It goes out on MailChimp. And then throughout the week, I post on social about the episodes that I'm listening to throughout the week as part of that list. So Monday, the Monday episode, Tuesday, the Tuesday episode, all the way throughout the week. And in addition to that, within the newsletter, I share, we have a community section, so people share their community news. We have a classified section where people can pay for ad spots. We have a spotlight section where I spotlight a podcast that week that has nothing to do with the theme that the curator has chosen, just so that if the theme does not intrigue you, maybe the spotlight will. So the newsletter is pretty rich with lots of different podcast recommendations and podcast tidbits. We also share news from Pod News, James Cridland's newsletter. And, it's evolved a lot since I started it. If you go back to the archives from 2017, first of all, it is not as aesthetically pleasing as it is now. To say it nicely, it has definitely changed. And I've learned a lot about email marketing. I've learned a lot about, how to compose an email, what's going to get people to be subscribers and want to share the newsletter week after week. So I've learned a lot. But about 2 years into the newsletter is when I said, okay, maybe I should be walking the walk, because at that time I was managing a podcast studio. I was advising people on podcasts and how to create them for their businesses, and whether or not they should have a trailer, or whether or not they should, interview people, or if it should be a narrative or a solo podcast, lots of different options. So I was advising people, but I had never actually had the experience of publishing an RSS feed myself. And I thought, okay, I should probably do this so that I can speak from experience. So 2019 is when I said, okay, let me make a companion podcast to the newsletter. And I mean, just to go back, the reason I didn't want to do it is because I thought there are so many podcasts out there, and nobody needs another podcast telling you about the podcast that you should listen to. But then I thought, you know what, I don't care if people listen or not. The main thing is my newsletter. I will always care about the newsletter first. The podcast is secondary. The podcast is an audio version of the newsletter. So if you want to hear me talk about the newsletter, you can do that in the podcast. But I'm not saying that in order to get the content of the newsletter, you have to listen to the podcast. That's never going to be the case. So started the podcast because I just felt like it was important for me to be able to say that I had a podcast. So not really any barriers to entry for me, not really anything that was stopping me, but just sort of like my own desire to sort of keep my newsletter only is what took me so long to start my podcast about podcast recommendations that goes along with Earbuds Podcast Collective, which is called Feedback with Earbuds, the podcast recommendation podcast.
It's the inception of inceptions. I love it. I love that part. And I know that changing and evolving is the best thing that you can do. And looking back on, like you said, your newsletter in the archives, it's incredible to see how things have changed, not only yourself and your newsletter, but the industry as well. Yeah. We actually had James on the show a couple episodes ago, and it's just interesting to hear like the parallels of, the newsletter is the focus, but it's like, why not throw in the podcast? Right. And some people even love to consume your newsletter information that way.
I know a lot of people consume James's newsletter via the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just like a complimentary, form of content that is like, why not do it? So yeah, I love that. So you're saying you worked in the studio and you were helping people and advising people with their podcast. What was one of the biggest things that you told them before they launched a show? What's your best advice there?
To not just pop on the microphone when you have a guest and record because you have that guest at that moment. I think a lot of people get excited by the idea of having a podcast. I get to have a podcast now. It's funny. I actually, this past Friday night, was at a movie screening that my friend directed, and I brought a friend, and then another friend popped by and brought another friend, and the third friend was like, oh yeah, I know Arielle from the podcast space. And this girl that he brought was like, oh my gosh, you work in podcasting? I've always wanted to have one. And I was like it's a puppy? Like you wanted to have a podcast like it's like, I was like, that's such a weird thing to say about wanting a podcast. So I just think a lot of people get excited by the idea of having a podcast and not enough people stop to think, what's the longevity plan of this podcast? How is it actually going to be here after 3 months if my goal is to keep it going? If you want to just pop yourself on the microphone for the sake of practicing interviews, that's fine. But I don't think that's most people's goal. I think a lot of people want to be able to outline the next few months, but they're just too impatient to do it. But I highly recommend that if you want to start a podcast, think about what your season 1 is going to be. And season 1 does not have to be 6 episodes. It's arbitrary what you choose as season 1 or season 2. It can be 10 episodes, 20 episodes, 100 episodes, and then you can retroactively call that a season. But I think it's important to have a plan for yourself, have a general story arc for each episode. And so to plan these things out in advance is something that I was advising.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with you because my process beforehand you took time. Like you thought, okay, what is the goal of this? Or am I going to just like ask all the same things? What's my storyline going to be? How are we going to grip listeners in? It's a lot of thought, a lot of planning. And then actually to practice, you kind of have to practice.
Yeah.
Because it's about the conversation. It's not just about, okay, I'm going to ask these questions and then I'm going to be done because you sound robotic. I mean, me too. I've evolved even over the last few recordings. I feel like I'm a different podcaster now too. But yeah, it's fun. It's good. It's good if this is what you want to do. But like you said, it's not something that you have to have like a puppy. It's something that you have to work on, put thought into.
I always wanted a podcast. I was like, what?
Well, you should just recommend, go on as a guest.
Yeah.
Try it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a good point. Oh, you want to practice being on a microphone? You want to get a microphone? Get a microphone. But try being a guest. You want to do this look that all the TikTok stars are doing, where if you scroll, you just see people talking
with headphones.
Yeah, it's fine. You can do that. You don't need to create yourself an RSS feed, but you can. I hate to gatekeep and be like, you don't need a podcast, but I think just don't treat podcasts like puppies.
Yeah.
Take care of them.
Especially thinking of all the work that we put into making
puppies.
it exactly that too. Take care of the puppies. Oh my gosh. Well, was there any surprising benefits that came out of finally launching your podcast with your newsletter? How has it helped you build and grow further?
I always recommend that if you have a podcast, you should have 3 reasons other than money and download numbers for making your podcast. So when I started this podcast Feedback with Earbuds in 2019, I had those reasons. I didn't have this articulation of it. Now my number one piece of advice is that you should have 3 reasons other than money and downloads for making your podcast. I didn't have that written out on a whiteboard, but I did have my 3 reasons in my head. And my 3 reasons were, number 1, I want to be able to walk the walk, like I mentioned before. Number 2, I like playing around with technology. This way I get to test technology that people share with me. I can say, yes, I'll implement this into the next episode. Dynamic ad insertion, or like we were discussing before, things like Podroll or or Trailergram or other things like this that you can play around with. And number 3 for me was I get to create an added value for the advertisers who advertise in my newsletter. I can also give them a 30-second ad read or 60-second ad read on my podcast, right? So those were the reasons that I started my podcast in 2019. Those reasons can and should evolve. They have evolved for me over the years, and they've taken on different shapes. And the reason that I've had this podcast has absolutely changed. And I highly recommend that if you have a podcast and you have those 3 reasons besides your downloads and your dollars, you should reassess every 6 months. Like, why are you making this podcast? Is it still worth it for you? So once I finally started the show, it was good for me because I got to, advertise. I got to give further push to my advertisers, which makes it so that they want to keep coming back. So yeah, those are a bunch of the reasons that I made the podcast at the time and continue to make the podcast now, and that continue to push me to make the show week after week. It's funny because last night, we're recording this on a Monday. My podcast goes out on Sunday nights, and I included in last night's issue a little note at the top that said, hey, are you aware that we have a podcast? Please reply yes or no, because it'll help me determine if I want to push more with my marketing efforts or if I want to take a little hiatus. And and this is a debate that I've been having for a while. The podcast does not get tons and tons of downloads. We get about 1,000 downloads per month across the catalog. It's not huge at all. And I've never really pushed it. I've never really tried to set up promo swaps, set up feed swaps, like guest on podcasts specifically to talk about this podcast. I've even thought about how, are we even ready for a podcast about podcast recommendations? I've thought about this a lot. So I am definitely at an inflection point. I'm also going away for all of the month of December. So I think it's a really natural time for me to at least take up a hiatus on this podcast, still play around with audio. And I can talk a little bit about that soon, but maybe not necessarily published by way of a podcast. So I am definitely thinking about the utility of this show. And I lost my train of thought, but I said that with authority.
Absolutely. You had your 3 reasons for starting your podcast other than downloads and dollars. And yeah, you absolutely like having to be able to walk the walk and do all those things. I see it. You implement totally. Like the other day, one of your episodes, you said, your microphone broke.
Yeah.
And you used
because right now we're recording. I'm holding my microphone. My bad, people. Not such best practices, but we're broken and we're trying.
Yes, we're getting it out there. And you use the technology to try, test the things. And it's, what a better way to do it is through your podcast, getting to play around with everything. And then that what you are recommending to other people is legit because you've actually used it. And yeah, I love seeing that happening throughout the show. But yeah, it's great. So one of the things I wanted to touch on is because of your, format of your podcast, you have these curated lists and anybody can do it. And then you have those people come on and actually do the podcast for you. So how do you kind of give those reins over for your show to somebody else to come on and speak and, still make sure that it's in line with what you want to put out there?
Yeah, this goes back to how the podcast has evolved over the years. So when I first started it in October of 2019, it was essentially me reading the newsletter out loud. And I put a little bit of music to it. I shared it with my engineering friend who made it sound good. He mixed and mastered it. And then, I did that for a few months. And and my mom was like, I listened to your podcast. And I was like, oh, what'd you think? And she was like, it's boring. And I was like, thank you so much. That's actually awesome for me to know. And my initial reaction was to defend myself. Yeah, it's meant to be boring. It's not meant to be the most entertaining thing in the world. It's really just an added value to the newsletter. And then I was like, wait, why am I making something that's boring? Right. Yeah. So then I thought, let's change this a little bit. Let me interview the curators. So I don't know if you listened that far back, but basically I went from just reading the newsletter out loud to interviewing each of the curators about the episodes that they chose, asking them why they chose that theme. It took me a while. Those interviews would go on sometimes for 45 minutes and I would have to cut them down to 15 to 30 minutes. And I was not seeing tons of listeners. You would hope if you made it so much less boring that it would be reflected in the download numbers, and it wasn't. So then I pivoted again. And now the shape of the show is that I introduce the show and I close out the show. And in between, the curator comes on and they record asynchronously where they answer a bunch of questions that I've written out for them. And they go through the 5 podcast episodes that they've selected that week, and they tell us why they chose them. They tell us a little bit about themselves. They tell us what they hope we get out of this theme and the episodes that they recommended. And so then I stitch it all together, put on some music, and it's a little bit more than me just opening up the show and closing out the show. I also, sometimes at the top of the show, give some recommendations, give some ideas. Then at the bottom of the show, I share the podcast spotlight pick. I share some podcast news that's going on in the world. We also talk about what James Cridland is covering in pod news and some other things here and there. But yeah, the show really has changed over the years. And I think at the stage that we're at now, it is a nice balance between the interview, which took the most time and maybe might have been the most interesting, but was the most work, and the boringness of just me reading out loud. So I think this is a good place for us to settle on. You asked me another question that I forgot. My brain is not coming together today. I'm unable to wrap up.
No, you're good. I think that the main thing that you're sharing is it's okay to reassess. You're allowed to stop and think, what can I do differently? Is this working? Is this not working? And then pivot, reassess, and streamline your process. Because I talk a lot about, like, if you're putting on all this work and all this effort, is it actually paying off? And if it isn't, why are you doing it? Like, your time is so much more valuable than you give yourself credit for. So streamline your process, make it more efficient, and do what works better.
You asked me about how I hand over the reins and how do I make sure the quality is good. Well, basically the way that works is that anyone can curate a list. We have a form on the website where anybody can submit a list. That does not mean that we select everybody, right? Like, we have tons of submissions. I would say we get at least 5 per week, and we should be getting more. It's a way to promote one of your podcasts. Yeah. Basically, the way it works is that each week, curated by a different person, anyone can curate a list. You can select one of your own episodes as part of that theme. The other 4 should be other episodes that fit into your theme in some way. So when you have a new show launching, or if you are starting a podcast network or whatever, you should know that this is a resource where you can curate a list and include one of your own episodes. Yeah. So we do not take everyone. We have a long list. We're booked out until March at this point. Like I said, it's the end of November right now. So we have a lot to choose from, and we make sure that if you are submitting a list, that list is well curated, and it's not just like, here's a bunch of my friends' podcasts, or here's a bunch of, shitty dude podcasts. Like, we like to make sure that it's a well curated list. And so I'm the curator of the curators, and I also have somebody who works for me who helps with that. Her name is Devin, and she's awesome. And we then send very specific instructions to the curators about how to record their voice clip. And we've tested this, the email that goes out to them that says, hey, thanks for submitting a list. We've selected you to go on this date. Here are a bunch of questions for you to answer in a voice clip. You can send it to us in MP3 or WAV file. And please do listen to the latest episode of the show where you can hear somebody else doing it the quote unquote right way. So we really make sure it's, and if somebody returns it back, and we really, like, pretty much 99% of the time, the voice clip is perfect, ready to go. We don't have to do anything to it except for maybe edit out some spaces, pauses, whatever. Every once in a while, we'll get somebody who, like, clearly didn't follow the prompt. And in that case, I'll be like, hey, you didn't read this.
Here, read it again. No, that's awesome. I think you have your system so well ironed out, and it's great advice to just be able to curate the curators. Like, if you are going down that road, make sure you're doing your due diligence the same way that you would with guests that you invite on the show. You never know what they're going to share if you don't kind of vet them first. So, yeah. But now, the other one that I wanted to talk about, I know your new podcast, the Trailer Park one, is also out there, and it's super interesting that you went down that road. And I know it's because you have this idea, not the idea, but you think that trailers are super important for your podcast. So do you have any advice to new podcasters starting out, why it's crucial to have a trailer and what they should be doing for it?
Yeah, you should definitely have a trailer for your podcast. And the reason is manyfold. One is the podcast listening apps have a space dedicated for your trailer. The different podcast listening apps have that function differently, but on Apple, there's an actual space that shows your trailer. So if somebody is scrolling and considering listening to your show, they are sort of prompted to give your trailer a try. And then that acts as an on-ramp. That's number 2. You maybe we'll have a bunch of 45-minute episodes, and that's not really a great way for somebody who is maybe considering trying out your show to figure out if they actually like it. But if you have a trailer, which is shorter, they can decide if they like you. You also then get to market your show. This is number 3, before it's time to really market your show. And what I mean by that is you can drop a trailer. It takes a lot less production know-how, production time, production blah, blah, blah. It takes a lot less time to create a trailer than it does to create a regular season episode. So if you can get your trailer ready to go and put that out on your RSS feed, even, 2 weeks, a month before your regular season is set to start, you can start sending people to your feed. You can say, it's essentially like populating your RSS feed before your RSS feed would be ready otherwise. So you can say, listen and subscribe because you can listen and subscribe. You have a place to send people. And just to go back to number one, which is that the podcast listening apps have a place for you to mark that your show is a trailer. That goes back to your podcast hosting site, which should allow you to mark your episodes as either bonus episodes, trailers, or regular season episodes. So you should make sure that when you do have a trailer, you can't just put it up as a regular episode. It has to be marked as a trailer episode so that it is reflected that way in the podcast listening apps.
Yeah, absolutely. I love trailers. It's the best way to sample what you're going to listen to, especially if you don't have time because you're busy and you want something specific. Listen to the trailer. You'll get a really good gist of not only what you're going to listen to, but the hosts themselves. Like, what is their voice like? Are you going to enjoy listening to their content? Or, it's a great idea. And you can check out all the newest trailers that Arielle has on Trailer Park. It's awesome. I love that. So I know you are a regular in the industry when it comes to monetization. So I wanted to touch on a little bit about that and what your strategy is for that, what you're currently doing, and some advice to go about, dipping into the dollars for your podcast.
I am actually not the best example when I look at my own podcasts of how, quote unquote, the average person is monetizing their podcast. So for earbuds, for feedback with earbuds, the monetization of the podcast is really contingent on the monetization of the newsletter. The ads are wrapped up. So when you buy an ad for my newsletter, you get an ad read on the podcast, depending on the tier that you choose for your newsletter ad. So you can do that. That is definitely something that you can set up is if you have a newsletter that goes along with your podcast, you can say 250 characters in the newsletter is X number of dollars, and that gets you also a 30-second ad read on the podcast. You could do that depending on the numbers that you have on both. Another way that I monetize, this is through the Trailer Park podcast, is also really not run-of-the-mill, which is that I reached out to a bunch of different products and services before season 1 started, and I said, we're going to have a podcast about podcast trailers. It is very industry specific. It's for people who want to improve their craft. It's about figuring out how to make a really great podcast trailer. But it's also for people who are discovering podcasts. It's also for people who want a quick hit to discover a new podcast by way of the podcast trailer and a bit of discussion around that trailer. Yeah. Do you want to advertise to the people who are going to be listening to this show? And when I was doing that, I did not have any listeners to boot. I couldn't say, we expect X number of listeners. I had no idea. You cannot predict that. So instead I said, I've been working in the podcast space for X amount of time. I have this kind of following on Twitter, this kind of following on LinkedIn. I tend to post about this kind of stuff. People follow me because of this kind of stuff. What is your budget? And we'll make it work. So we worked with Focusrite, which is an audio equipment company, and they had recently launched a product called Vocaster, which is the first audio interface made specifically for podcasters. And we worked with them they sponsored monetarily, which was great. And then they also gave away one Vocaster on every episode of season 1 of the show. So that was really awesome for us to be able to say we were giving something away to our listeners just because they were listening. So yes, we monetized by way of dollars, but also we monetized by way of legitimacy. We got to say, look at this really legit company that is partnering with us. They're lending their legitimacy to us by doing that. In addition to that, we had a non-monetary sponsor, which was a podcast hosting site, Ausha, A-U-S-H-A. It's a French-based company. It's a Paris-based company. And they gave us free hosting in exchange for shouting them out on the show and all the other things that come along with that. They're a really innovative company that really takes marketing front and center. So they do they have a newsletter built in. They automatically publish to YouTube. They now have this product called PSO, Podcast Search Engine, Search Optimization, where they can figure out your keywords and where you're ranking. So that's really, really great. And we loved working with them. We're still working with them for season 2. And then we had 3 other sponsors for season 1, and some of them were direct dollars and some of them were indirect dollars. And then for season 2 of the show, we are working with new sponsors, and some are direct dollars and some are not direct dollars. And my goal really in terms of benchmarking dollar amounts is to offset the cost of now we hired somebody to help us go through all of the submissions for Trailer Park, because you can submit your trailer to be featured. We had over 250 submissions. That's a lot of submissions. So we hired somebody to help us do that. And I want to offset the cost of hiring her. She's great, but I'm funding this on my own,
Yeah.
So those are some of the ways that we went about monetizing season 1 and upcoming season 2 for the show. Those are not normal. Those are, it takes a certain amount of privilege for me. I've been working in the industry for 7 years. Yep. So I have a little bit of a reputation that I can rest on. I can say, you should want to sponsor me because of what I've done in the podcast space and the number of followers that I have and the people that trust me to do X, Y, and Z. But not everybody can do that. So a lot of people will need to look for other methods to monetize their podcast. The most common one is the CPM model, the clicks per milli, cost per milli, which is, how many downloads, how many dollars are you charging per 1,000 listeners? And in the podcast space, it tends to be between 25 and 75. That's the average-ish. But there's also higher and lower depending on the product fit and depending on a number of factors. And those are hard to do because they don't really make sense unless you have a large number of downloads. So I think that if you are, I'm looking at my inbox on my other screen, and I just got an email from Podcorn, which is a podcast advertiser marketplace that I highly recommend people check out. And it was really convenient that email just popped up because I was about to talk about it. That's actually how I sponsored how I got my podcast sponsored a few years ago. I had a podcast during the pandemic called Counter Programming, which was a very ridiculous podcast concept. It was me and my friend. She was in New York. I was in LA. And it was the height of the pandemic, and there was so much grim news around COVID-19. So we thought, let's offer counter programming. We'll offer some fun alternative stuff that you can listen to. The kicker is that each episode is going to have to do with anything with the word count or counter in the title. So counter programming. So we had a series on countertops: marble, steel, granite, wood, laminate, quartz, whatever. Then we did a bunch of episodes on Count Negroni, Count Von Count, Count Dracula, Your Vote Counts, Counting Crows. Like, I could go on all day. We did this for a year and a half.
Wow.
And it was ridiculous. And pretty early on, we were like, let's play around with monetization.
Yeah.
So we went on Podcorn. And the way it works is that advertisers go on Podcorn and creators go on Podcorn. Advertisers say, here's what we're looking to spend. Here are the types of podcasts that we would like to advertise on. Here's what a campaign looks like. And then you apply to those. So we applied to a bunch of different advertisers that we thought would make sense for our listeners. And we got some yeses, and we got to monetize the show. We did not make money from this endeavor, but we definitely offset the costs a little bit. So that was fun.
Yeah. Well, I love that because it's the thing. It goes back to what you said before. It shouldn't be your main reasons why you're podcasting is to make money. But if you can do it systematically to offset the costs, make it easier for you to keep doing what you're doing with your podcast, then that's perfect. But yeah, just get out there and build your brand, build your authenticity and your credibility in the industry, and work with that. Make partnerships that are beneficial to you as a podcaster and maybe as your business as well. So yeah, great advice on that front. Well, Arielle, it's been great to hear your story, and thanks for the incredible advice that you've been sharing with the listeners. And now I just want to kind of jump into the quick fire questions to pick your brain a little bit and see what pops to mind. Okay. So the first one is, how has podcasting changed the way you do business or life?
I don't know where I would be professionally if I had never gotten into podcasts. My first job out of college, I worked for a nonprofit in Jackson, Mississippi. I wasn't that good at it, if I'm being honest. And it's because my complete passions weren't there. So now I've learned through audio that I need to be passionate about something in order to do a good job. And I am so lucky that I love audio and that I'm good at this business and that I have these connections and that I'm motivated to keep up these connections. I'm so lucky that I found that. Not everybody finds that with their career. So to me, like, going to work is not a chore. I genuinely enjoy the connections that I get to make in audio. So I don't even know if that answered your question, but ultimately, yes, it's changed the way, I remember your question. Changed the way I do everything because it means that I know what I need in order to be successful.
Yeah. No, I love it because it goes down to exactly what you want to be doing. You're not wasting your time doing things that you're not passionate about. So it's great. What are your top 3 tools or a non-negotiable investment for your podcast?
I'm going to do some corporate shilling here, but I use Squadcast to record my podcast. I edit in Descript, which I was not using, I'd been using Squadcast way before I worked for Squadcast. So when I saw that there was a job opening, I was like, yeah, I want to work for this company. Worked for that company, loved it, and then followed the ride. We did a great job, got acquired by Descript. I did not use Descript before I worked there, and now it is the only thing that I use. Yeah. So it's completely changed the way that I work, and it's also helped me a lot with automations, or like automating my workflow and figuring out different AI tools that make things a little bit faster. So I'm loving that. And then my third tool that is a non-negotiable is, here's the truth. Like, I wish I could say Notion or Airtable, but I'm not the most organized person in the world. Yeah. So that's not really it. I hate to say this, but Twitter is huge for me still. Yeah. And it is November of 2023. Elon Musk is showing his stripes. Is that the phrase? He is not a good guy. He is not on the right side of history. And yet I still find that I am using Twitter to ask for feedback, to look for resources, to make connections. Mm-hmm. And it's still, to this day, has been great for me. I do recognize that there are other social platforms that I have been spending time on, should be spending more time on. I should be building elsewhere. I don't want to put all my eggs in the Twitter basket. So I'm also building up on Threads. I'm also building up on LinkedIn, places like that. But, that's not necessarily a tool. However, I have been using social media like a tool for the past few years. Yeah. I have been building up a following there and using that following and being fueled by that following. So yeah, I guess to a certain extent, it is a tool for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So what have your biggest learning lessons been since starting your podcast?
One of my biggest lessons from starting podcasts is that, just because you put a ton of time and effort into it does not mean you're entitled to listeners. And just because you want feedback from people does not mean you're going to get feedback from people. Yeah. People have a lot of other content that they could be consuming. So just being able to acknowledge that is huge, because you have to work for every single listener. So yeah, that's one of the biggest lessons.
Yeah, true. Appreciate your audience because they're there because they choose it, right? So final question. If money or time were not a factor, what would be next for your podcast? Or you?
I'll refer to Trailer Park for this answer. If money or time were not a factor, what would be next is my co-host Tim and I would be always on. We would always make the show. It would be weekly, and we would probably outsource all of our editing, and we would probably pay for ads on other shows, and that's what we would do. And just try to grow the pie, because ultimately the goal of Trailer Park, the podcast Trailer Podcast, is yes, to help people find new podcasts to listen to, and yes, to help creators make really great trailers, but it's also to grow the podcast industry. I want more people to be exposed to a podcast that might be their next favorite podcast, and that might help them, just grow the industry, which will help more creators get paid. So that's really why I would want to spend money on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting when you meet someone and they're like, I've never listened to a podcast. And you're like, what?
Let me change you.
Let me change you. Oh, I love that. Well, Arielle, thank you so much for all the incredible advice you shared. You are an inspiration in the audio industry, and just love seeing everything that you do, and continue to encourage you to keep going and do all the great work. So thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone, go and check out her newsletter and subscribe so you can get all the latest recommendations. And we will see you next time.